The year is 2029. A spacecraft settles onto a rust-colored plain, its landing thrusters kicking up a thin curtain of iron dust that drifts slowly in gravity, weaker than anything the crew has felt in months. 4 human beings sit inside a pressurized cabin, breathing recycled air, listening to the creak and tick of metal, adjusting to temperatures that swing more than 200 degrees between day and night. And then one of them looks up through the viewport, and there it is, a pale blue dot, hanging in a black sky, smaller than a fingernail held at arm's length. Everything they have ever known is in that dot. Every person they love, every ocean, every mountain, every city. The mission controllers who have been tracking every telemetry signal for the past 7 months. All of it are compressed into a single point of pale light. Most people, if they imagine this moment at all, imagine it as a beginning, the first chapter of something enormous, the opening of an era in which human beings become a multi-planetary species, and these 4 astronauts are simply the first in a long line of travelers who will make the journey, plant roots, and eventually, one day, come home. The common understanding of Mars exploration treats it the way we treat any difficult expedition: extraordinary, dangerous, demanding every ounce of human ingenuity, but ultimately survivable, ultimately reversible. You go, you do the work, and you return. That understanding is wrong. Not wrong in the way that a plan sometimes goes wrong, where something breaks and the mission is cut short. Wrong in a deeper, quieter, more permanent way. These 4 astronauts, breathing their recycled air and staring at that pale blue dot, are not at the beginning of a round trip. The physics of this universe, its radiation, its distances, its gravity wells, the biology of the human body, and the mechanics of the mind have already made the decision for them. They are never coming back. Not because something went wrong, because nothing can go right enough. Before we go any further, if you enjoy documentaries that take apart the things you think you understand and show you what is actually underneath, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people, and I am grateful for every single one of you who is here. Now, settle in and get yourself comfortable. This is the story of why anyone who goes to Mars will never come back. Here, let us begin. The distance between Earth and Mars is not a logistical inconvenience. That is the first thing you need to understand about why this mission is different from every mission that came before it. And it is worth sitting with carefully, because the brain has a way of hearing large numbers and categorizing them as simply far, without really absorbing what far means at this scale. At its closest approach, when the 2 planets are aligned favorably on the same side of the Sun, Mars is approximately 55 million kilometers from Earth. At its farthest, on the opposite side of the Sun, the distance stretches to roughly 400 million kilometers. The average, accounting for the full range of the orbital dance between them, is approximately 225 million kilometers. But those numbers are large enough that they tend to pass through the mind without leaving much of an impression. So let us try to make them physical. The distance from Earth to the Moon, the distance that Apollo astronauts crossed in 3 days, the distance that defined the single most ambitious achievement in the history of human spaceflight, is 384,000 kilometers. That distance felt enormous when we first crossed it, and in human terms, it still is. But when you hold it next to the distance to Mars, even at its closest approach, the Moon stops being a destination and starts being a rounding error. At 55 million kilometers, Mars at its nearest is approximately 143 times farther than the Moon, and that is the good case. At the far end of the orbital cycle, at 400 million kilometers, the distance is more than 1,000 times the Earth-Moon gap. The Moon, which took the astronauts of Apollo 3 days to reach, would have to be stacked end to end more than 1,000 times before you arrived at Mars on the wrong side of the Sun. Now sit with that for a moment, because this is where the implications begin. Light travels at 186,000 miles per second. Nothing in this universe moves faster. Not a transmission, not a radio signal, not a command sent from mission control. This is not an engineering limitation that better technology will eventually overcome. It is a property of the universe itself, fixed and absolute, as permanent as any law of nature we have ever confirmed. And yet, moving at 186,000 miles per second, A signal sent from Earth to Mars takes between 4 and 24 minutes to arrive, depending on where the two planets are in their orbits. The round trip, your signal leaving Earth, reaching Mars, and a response returning, takes between 8 and 40 plus minutes. On the day the gap is widest, you could send a message to your crew on Mars and wait more than 40 minutes for any reply at all. This is the first thing that separates Mars from every exploration humans have ever attempted. Not the distance itself, but what the distance does to the fundamental relationship between the explorer and home. To understand why that relationship matters so much, it helps to look at what it has meant in every previous chapter of human exploration. When Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance was crushed by pack ice in the Weddell Sea in 1915, stranding his crew on one of the most hostile surfaces on Earth, the situation was catastrophic by any measure. But embedded in that catastrophe was a fact that made survival possible in principle. Rescue, however unlikely and however long delayed, was not physically impossible. Ships could reach him. People on the far side of the world were alive, aware, and capable of mounting a response. And eventually, through one of the most extraordinary feats of seamanship ever recorded, Shackleton reached help and every one of his men survived. The lifeline was thin, almost to the point of invisibility, but it existed. When Apollo 13 lost an oxygen tank on the way to the moon in April of 1970, the crew had less than a second of signal delay between their spacecraft and the people at Mission Control in Houston who were working to save their lives. Engineers could hear the problem in nearly real time, calculate solutions in nearly real time, and relay instructions in nearly real time. That 1.3-second round-trip delay, the actual measured round-trip communication time between Earth and the Moon, was so small, it was functionally indistinguishable from a live conversation. The crew survived because the people working to keep them alive could respond to conditions as they were happening, not as they had been 14 minutes ago. A sailor in distress in the open ocean today can radio the Coast Guard, describe the crisis, and have someone responding within seconds. Yet, the gap between the problem and the assistance is measured in the time it takes a human being to pick up a radio handset and speak. Mars offers none of this. Not a slower version of it, not a degraded version of it, but none of it, as a matter of physics, permanently and without exception. Imagine one of those 4 astronauts on the rust-colored plane in 2029 discovers that a seal in the habitat has failed. Pressure is dropping. The situation is deteriorating. She reaches the communications system and sends a distress call to Earth. That signal, moving at the absolute speed limit of the universe, takes 14 minutes to arrive, a best-case number, near closest approach. Mission Control hears the call. Engineers begin working the problem. Airs the fastest possible response, leaves Earth 14 seconds after the signal arrives, and takes another 14 minutes to travel back. 28 minutes have elapsed from the moment she called for help to the moment any reply could physically reach her. In 28 minutes, a pressure emergency in a confined habitat does not wait. She is either dead or she has already saved herself using only what she and her crewmates had in the room at the moment it started. There is no third option. The people at Mission Control are not rescue workers in this scenario. They are viewers watching something unfold on a screen, with no power to intervene in anything that happens in the next half hour. This is not a metaphor. This is a measurement. Every prior framework of human exploration has been built on the existence of a lifeline, some thread, however fragile, connecting the explorer to a source of help beyond their own resources. Shackleton had the thread. Apollo had the thread. Every crewed mission to the International Space Station has the thread, because a Soyuz capsule at the station can return a crew to Earth in a matter of hours. The thread has sometimes been gossamer thin, stretched to its absolute limit, nearly invisible, but it has never been fully cut. Mars cuts it. The speed of light, the fixed and non-negotiable constant of this universe, severs that thread permanently the moment the spacecraft leaves Earth's immediate vicinity and begins the 7-month journey outward. And that severing is absolute in a way that no improvement in technology will change. And better engines might reduce the transit time, better communication equipment might clarify the signal, but nothing will make light move faster, and nothing will therefore shrink the delay below its physics-mandated minimum. On the day Mars is at its closest, the minimum possible round-trip communication delay is roughly 8 minutes. On the day it is farthest, it is more than 40. The average, across the full span of a mission, sits somewhere in the middle of that range, and it never becomes less than 8. There is no version of the future in which an astronaut on Mars calls Earth and hears a voice respond before 8 minutes have passed. So the safety net of every exploration humans have ever conducted does not stretch to cover Mars. It simply ends. And the crew of that spacecraft on that rust-colored plane must confront a fact that no previous explorer in human history has had to fully absorb. They are beyond the reach of help, not practically beyond it, not logistically beyond it, but physically, permanently, and absolutely beyond it, by the decree of the universe's own operating rules. But perhaps you are settling into a kind of resigned acceptance of that fact. Perhaps the logic runs something like this. They accepted the risk, they trained for independence, they brought everything they need, and if something goes wrong, they handle it themselves. The lifeline is cut, but they chose to cut it, and at least they can decide to come home when they need to. At least the choice of return remains theirs. Now, the question of whether that choice actually exists, whether the option to simply decide to leave and fly home is something these 4 people actually possess, is where the argument becomes significantly more uncomfortable. That choice, the choice to come home, sounds simple when you frame it a certain way. The crew decides they need to leave. They board the return vehicle, and they go. It sounds like the kind of decision that belongs to the people making it, governed only by their own judgment and their own readiness. The truth is almost precisely the opposite. The decision of when to leave Mars does not belong to the crew. It does not belong to mission control or to the engineers who built the spacecraft or to anyone operating in the domain of human choice at all. It belongs to orbital mechanics. And orbital mechanics is not a system that negotiates. Here is what that actually means. Earth and Mars orbit the Sun at different speeds, tracing different-sized paths around the same central point. And the relationship between those 2 paths means that the planets only align favorably for travel between them at a specific interval. That interval is roughly 26 months. Every 26 months, Earth and Mars reach a configuration that makes the journey between them achievable with anything resembling the rocket technology we have or are likely to develop within the lifetime of any early mission. Miss that window, and the next one is 26 months away. Not weeks away, not months away with a little patience, 26 months away by the geometry of the solar system, which has been running on its own schedule for 4.5 billion years without any particular interest in human emergency. The physics does not care about hope or urgency or homesickness. It does not care that someone's parent is dying on Earth, or that the habitat is slowly failing, or that 4 people have simply decided they want to go home. The window closes and the waiting begins, and nothing that happens inside a spacecraft on a rust-colored plane can accelerate the moment when the planets return to alignment. To understand what 26 months of waiting actually looks like when you are standing at the wrong end of it, you have to sit with the scale of the commitment that anyone traveling to Mars accepts before they ever leave the launch pad. The transit from Earth to Mars alone takes between 6 and 9 months, and depending on the specific window and the specific trajectory, and that is only one leg of the journey. Once the crew arrives and the window closes behind them, because the window closes behind them, not after them, not when they are ready, but according to the orbital calendar that does not flex, they must wait on the Martian surface for the next window to open before they can attempt the return. That surface stay can last anywhere from several months to well over a year, depending on the architecture of the mission. Then another 6 to 9 months home. When you add those numbers together with any degree of honesty, the shortest plausible round trip to Mars is approximately 3 years. Many of the mission architectures that have been seriously studied and seriously proposed extend to 5 years or beyond. 3 years, 5 years, and you have to let those numbers mean something before you move past them. 3 years is not an extended expedition. It is not a long deployment of the kind that military personnel have endured, separated from home, but never more than a flight away. It is a span of time in which governments change and elections are held, and the political landscape of the country that launched you becomes unrecognizable to the one that receives you. It is a span of time in which a child who was 7 years old when a parent walked into a training facility is 10 years old when, if everything goes as planned, if nothing goes wrong, If every launch window is met and every transit is completed, that parent might return. 5 years is longer than most romantic relationships last. 5 years is long enough for the companies that built the spacecraft to restructure, for the engineers who know the systems most intimately to take other jobs, for institutional memory to quietly dissolve. These are not camping trips. These are not extended deployments. These are spans of time in which a person's entire context, every relationship, every institution, every assumption they brought with them, has continued changing without them, and will continue changing, and will have accumulated so much change by the time of return that the world receiving them will not be quite the same world that sent them, and we have not even left Earth orbit yet. Now lay across all of this the actual history of how long it has taken humanity to even approach the point of attempting this. In 2016, Elon Musk stood at a podium and described a path to putting humans on Mars by 2024. That was the target year spoken aloud in a public presentation attached to a serious proposal with engineering specifics behind it. By 2020, that target had slipped to 2026. By the time the current planning horizon solidified, it shifted again to 2029. And even that date, even the modest and repeatedly revised goal of landing an uncrewed spacecraft on Martian soil by 2026, comes with odds that Musk himself has stated at roughly 50-50. Not confident, not approaching certain, a coin flip, attached to an uncrewed test mission, which is itself the prerequisite for even beginning to discuss a crewed attempt. The pattern here is not incompetence, and as these are some of the most capable engineers and organizations in the world working on this problem, the pattern is genuine difficulty. The repeated slippage of every timeline is the problem demonstrating its own scale, advertising through delay what it costs to solve. Mars One, a private venture founded in 2011, drew more than 200,000 applicants who expressed willingness to go. 200,000 people who raised their hands and said yes, and the organization went bankrupt in 2019 without having come close to building a spacecraft capable of reaching its destination. The enthusiasm has never been the limiting factor. The problem itself is the limiting factor. So the cage is built. The orbital mechanics create an entry point but seal behind anyone who passes through it. And the minimum time before any exit opens again is measured not in days or weeks or even months, but in years. 3 years at the very best. 5 or more if anything disrupts the most optimistic sequence of events. That cage is not a metaphor for difficulty. It is the actual geometry of 2 planets moving around the same star at speeds no human decision can modify. The physics does not care about hope or urgency or homesickness, and it never will. And no version of this mission at any point in the future will include an emergency exit that opens on demand. But the cage is only the beginning of what must be understood, because into that cage, for those 3 to 5 years, you must place a human body, and the human body was not designed to survive what those years, in that environment, will attempt to do to it. Begin with the body in that cage, and begin with something small, not a number yet, but an image. When the astronauts aboard the International Space Station look down through their windows, they are looking at Earth from 400 kilometers above its surface. 400 kilometers. If you drove that distance on a highway, you would cross roughly the distance from Los Angeles to San Francisco, or from London to Edinburgh. You could leave in the morning and arrive in time for dinner, and from that distance, a single afternoon's drive, if it were a road, if it were flat, if it were traversable at all, the Earth fills the window. It is enormous. It is overwhelming. It curves at the edges of the glass. Astronauts who have looked at it from that altitude describe something that has come to be called the overview effect, a sudden, almost physical shift in perspective, a feeling that the planet is fragile and whole and terrifyingly beautiful, and that the divisions humans have drawn across its surface, borders, walls, the invisible lines of nations, simply disappear. The planet from 400 kilometers looks like home, and it looks like it needs protecting. Now extend that to Mars, and watch what happens to that feeling. At Mars, Earth does not fill any window. It does not dominate any sky. From the surface of Mars, even at closest approach, at 55 million kilometers, which is as near as the 2 planets ever come, Earth is a bright point of light, not a disk, not a shape with continents and oceans. A point, visible to the naked eye but indistinguishable in character from 100 other bright points scattered across the same sky. And at greatest separation, when the two planets are on opposite sides of the Sun at 400 million kilometers apart, Earth dims to something even smaller, barely brighter than the stars behind it. Every person those 4 astronauts have ever known is on that point of light. Every meal they remember, every street they learned to walk on as children, every room they have ever considered home. The overview effect that astronauts describe from orbit, that sudden, transformative love for the fragile planet in the window, becomes, from Mars, its precise and devastating inversion, not transcendence, diminishment. Sit with that image for a moment. Every person who has ever loved you, every place you have ever called home, compressed into a point of light barely distinguishable from the surrounding stars. The pale blue dot. Carl Sagan used that phrase to describe a photograph taken by Voyager 1 in 1990, when the probe had traveled far enough to turn its camera back toward the inner solar system and photograph Earth from roughly 6 billion kilometers away. He wrote about how every king and peasant, every mother and father, every inventor and explorer in the history of our species had lived out their lives on that mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The image has been famous ever since. But here is the thing. From Mars, Earth would appear even larger than it did to Voyager. Mars is closer, and that fact makes it worse, not better. Ours, because from Mars, Earth is not a philosophical abstraction photographed by a departing machine. It is close enough to find without a telescope, close enough to see the way you can see Venus in the early evening sky from your backyard, which is to say, it appears smaller than Venus appears to us, a cold and distant gleam, carrying everything, offering nothing. The astronaut knows what is on that point of light. They know the faces, they know the voices, and none of it can reach them in any form resembling the way human beings actually need to be reached. Because what the distance does to communication is not merely inconvenient, it dismantles the entire structure of what human connection requires to survive. At minimum, a signal from Earth takes 4 minutes to arrive at Mars. At maximum, across the full range of orbital positions, yet it takes 24 minutes. A reply then takes another 4 to 24 minutes to return. The practical consequence is that every exchange between a Mars crew and anyone on Earth, a family member, a physician, a mission controller, takes a minimum of 8 minutes and regularly stretches past 40. There is no conversation. There is correspondence. You say something, and then you wait, and then something comes back that was composed and recorded and sent in the absence of whatever you just said. The spontaneity that all human connection depends on is simply absent. The back and forth that feels so natural when 2 people are in the same room, or even on a phone call with milliseconds of delay, does not exist. Consider what that means for a parent. Planned crew sizes for initial Mars missions range from 4 to 12 people, and some of those people will have children. A child who is 7 years old when the mission launches will be 10 or older before any crewed vehicle could possibly return. And in the years between, if that child falls and is hurt, if that child has a nightmare, if that child needs to hear a parent's voice at 2 in the morning, the parent on Mars cannot be that voice in any meaningful sense. They can send a recording. They can speak their love into a microphone and transmit it across 55 million kilometers of open space, and 20 minutes later, those words will arrive. But the child who needed comfort in that moment has already moved through the moment without it. The parent has watched helplessly from a distance that no vehicle in human history has ever crossed in less than 7 months. The communication delay is not a flaw in the system that better technology might one day solve. The delay is the speed of light, which is the absolute limit of information transfer in this universe, and it cannot be reduced by any amount of engineering. We have some data about what sustained separation does to people, and it is not encouraging. Servicemen and women deployed to conflict zones, separated from families for months at a time, with access to phone calls, video calls, real-time voices, familiar faces on a screen, show elevated rates of depression and post-traumatic stress, and the marriages of deployed personnel dissolve at rates measurably higher than the civilian population. That is with modern communication. That is with the ability to hear a voice respond within a second. That is with the knowledge, however painful, is that the deployment ends on a known date and the return is coming. Mars offers none of those things. Mars offers delayed recordings, correspondence with a gap so large that any emergency, any crisis, any moment of desperate need will be fully resolved or fully unresolved before the reply can possibly arrive. There will be no midnight phone calls. There will be no spontaneous words of reassurance landing in the moment they are needed. What exists instead is something closer to the letters that sailors sent from months at sea in the 18th century, knowing the recipient would read them in a world that had continued moving in their absence. Except the sailors could eventually come home. The mechanics of that return were not governed by the orbital schedule of two planets. And this is what distance ultimately does when it is large enough and permanent enough. It transforms the astronaut, slowly and without their full consent, into an abstraction to the people who love them. Not gone, not dead, but unreachable in the way that matters. A presence reduced to recordings, to a bright point in the sky visible on clear nights if you know where to look, to someone who exists in memory more vividly than in any form of present contact. And everything those astronauts knew, the pale blue dot carrying their entire world, becomes equally abstract in return. But the distance is not dealing in abstractions. The body does not deal in abstractions. The body deals in forces, in the pull of gravity, in the load on bone, in the demands of muscle. And across these timescales, the body begins to betray its owner. The body begins this process long before anyone sets foot on Martian soil. It begins in the first days of microgravity, quietly, without drama, without any sensation the astronaut can feel. And it begins because the body is not malfunctioning. That is the part that takes a moment to absorb. The bone loss that starts almost immediately upon leaving Earth's gravity is not a flaw in human biology. It is human biology working exactly as it was designed to work, responding rationally to a new set of conditions, making an intelligent and devastating decision that the structures built to carry a body through one gravitational environment are unnecessary in another, and that the resources required to maintain them are better spent elsewhere. Bone is not static. This is something most people understand in the abstract but rarely sit with. And your skeleton is constantly being broken down and rebuilt, old material resorbed, new material deposited, and the rate at which new bone is laid down is governed largely by mechanical load. When bones are stressed by gravity and movement and the resistance of carrying weight through the world, the body reads that stress as a signal to maintain and reinforce. Remove the stress and the signal weakens. The body concludes, through mechanisms refined across billions of years of evolution, that the architecture is overbuilt for its current environment, and so it begins to dismantle. In microgravity, astronauts lose bone mass at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% per month in the weight-bearing regions of the skeleton, the hips, the spine, the legs. That number sounds clinical and manageable when stated in isolation, and so it is worth placing it alongside something familiar: the bone loss associated with postmenopausal osteoporosis, a condition that occupies an enormous amount of medical research, that concerns entire specialties of medicine, that is considered one of the significant health crises of aging populations, proceeds at roughly 1 to 2% per year. The astronaut in microgravity is losing bone at a rate 12 times faster than a postmenopausal woman losing bone to osteoporosis. Every month in space compresses what would take a year on Earth into 30 days, and the body does not experience this as suffering. It experiences it as optimization. Scott Kelly spent a year aboard the International Space Station beginning in 2015, and his mission became one of the most studied examples of what sustained spaceflight does to a human body. He was carefully monitored, rigorously exercised, medically observed throughout, and after his return, he described months of recovery, pain, swelling, a body that had genuinely forgotten what it weighed. He came back, he recovered, but he was in microgravity for 12 months. The crew heading to Mars will spend 6 to 9 months in transit on the outbound journey alone, which means that before they ever breathe Martian air, before they ever see the surface with their own eyes, the outbound transit alone will have stripped between 6 and 12% of their bone density in the most critical weight-bearing regions of their bodies. And we have not even landed on Mars yet. The crew on that mission will have exercised. And this is worth acknowledging honestly, because the exercise program that ISS astronauts follow represents a genuine attempt to slow this process, and it does slow it. 2 hours of structured exercise every day, resistance training, cardiovascular work, carefully designed protocols. That is what it takes to modulate the rate of loss aboard the International Space Station. And even with 2 hours of daily effort, bone loss still occurs. The exercise helps. It does not solve the problem. It is the equivalent of trying to bail water from a slowly sinking vessel. The effort matters. The water level rises more slowly, and the vessel is still sinking. Medications called bisphosphonates can slow the process further by interfering with the resorption mechanism, and they will almost certainly be part of any Mars mission's medical kit. But they too reduce the rate. They do not reverse the trajectory. So the crew lands on Mars having already lost a significant fraction of their bone density, and now comes the question that nobody has a clean answer to. Mars has gravity, 38% of Earth's gravity, which sounds, when you first hear it, like it might be enough. More than microgravity, more than the transit. Surely landing on a surface, feeling weight underfoot, would begin to signal to the body that reinforcement is needed again. The honest answer from the scientific community is that we do not know. No human has ever lived in Martian gravity. No human has ever spent years at 38% of one gravity. The experiment has never been run, and when it is finally run, the subjects will be the colonists themselves. Yet what laboratory simulations and models suggest, and this must be held carefully, as a suggestion rather than a certainty, is that the threshold at which gravity becomes sufficient to maintain musculoskeletal health may be somewhere around 40% of Earth's gravity. Mars sits at 38%, below the threshold that studies suggest may be necessary to halt the deterioration, which means the body that arrives on Mars already depleted may continue to lose bone while standing on Martian ground, moving through Martian rooms, living a Martian life. The cruelest version of this possibility is not that the body deteriorates during transit and then recovers on the surface. The cruelest version is that the body simply continues, and bone is only one system. Muscle follows the same logic through the same mechanism. In the absence of gravitational load and the full demands of moving a body through a one-gravity environment, muscle mass begins to decline rapidly, up to 20% lost in a single month, with muscle strength falling by up to 30% across the same period. These are not the gradual losses of a sedentary lifestyle accumulated over years. This is the body actively reducing tissue it has determined to be in excess of current requirements. The astronaut who departs Earth as a physical specimen optimized by years of training, cardiovascular fitness in the top fractions of the human population, musculature built for performance, bones dense from decades of load-bearing activity, that astronaut is gradually, methodically, and without any subjective sense of decline, becoming something different, not metaphorically, physiologically. The body is not enduring the conditions of space and Mars. The body is adapting to them. The cardiovascular system declines in parallel, because a heart that no longer has to work against significant gravity to pump blood to the extremities becomes a smaller, less efficient heart. Fluid redistribution in microgravity shifts blood toward the head and chest, and the body responds by reducing total blood volume because it reads the fluid distribution as excess. The spine, freed from compression, expands, discs absorbing fluid, vertebrae separating, and astronauts gain 1 to 2 inches of height in space, which sounds almost amusing until you understand that this expansion comes with its own pain, its own muscular disruption, its own structural reconfiguration that must reverse upon return. And then there are the eyes. Yet 2/3 of long-duration astronauts experience a condition called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, SANS, in which intracranial pressure changes reshape the eyeball, flatten the optic nerve, and permanently alter vision. 2/3. Not a rare edge case, not an unusual complication. The majority of people who spend extended periods in microgravity come back with eyes that no longer work the way they did before they left. Some recover partially, some do not, and no one is certain whether this damage, sustained over the years of a Mars mission, would be reversible, or whether it would simply be the new baseline of sight. Now consider what happens when all of these systems fail, not in sequence, but simultaneously, compounding each other in a cascade. Bone depleted, muscle reduced, cardiovascular capacity diminished, a spine reconfigured, vision altered. Each one alone is serious. Together, they describe a body that has been remade for a different environment, and a body that, if it attempted to return to Earth and stand in full gravity after years on Mars, would face a gravitational load increase of 260%, from 38% of 1 gravity to 1 full gravity. If someone who had been carrying 40 pounds every day of their life was suddenly required to carry 100 pounds, not briefly, not as an experiment, but continuously, from the moment they landed, in every movement of every day, that is the demand that Earth's gravity would place on a cardiovascular system calibrated for Mars, on muscles reduced to a fraction of their former capacity, on bones that may have continued to thin even on Martian ground. And the numbers here are not the estimates of pessimists. They are the measurements of what happens to human bodies in reduced gravity, and they suggest that the longer someone remains on Mars, the more completely their body becomes Martian, and the less survivable Earth becomes in return. The body's betrayal is visible in this way, measurable in bone scans and muscle assessments, and the vision charts pressed against the faces of returning astronauts who squint at letters they could once read from across the room. But there is another assault underway alongside all of this, one that cannot be seen or felt, one that does not announce itself through pain or weakness, or the slow ache of a spine that no longer remembers its original length. It operates at the molecular level, in the nucleus of every cell, rewriting instructions strand by strand. And the physics of this universe make it not merely difficult to stop, but essentially impossible. And this assault, the one operating at the molecular level, in the nucleus of every cell, begins long before any astronaut sets foot on Martian ground. It begins the moment the spacecraft clears the boundary of something you have lived inside your entire life without ever knowing it was there. The Earth is a sanctuary, not because human beings built walls against the hostile universe, not because engineers designed a protective layer around the biosphere, but because the universe itself, or rather the mechanics of this particular planet, constructed those walls on our behalf billions of years before we existed to benefit from them. The magnetic field generated by Earth's molten iron core extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space, deflecting the charged particles streaming constantly from the sun and redirecting them away from the surface. Above that, the atmosphere, a layer averaging roughly 10 kilometers thick, which sounds substantial until you understand that if the Earth were a basketball, the atmosphere would be thinner than a single coat of paint, absorbs and scatters the radiation that does penetrate the magnetic field. Every breath you take, every moment of every day you have ever lived, occurs within this cocoon of protection. You never perceive it. There is nothing to feel, nothing to see, no sensation of being shielded. It is simply the condition of being alive on this planet. The radiation passing through you right now, a background radiation from cosmic sources and trace elements in soil and the bricks of buildings, amounts to roughly 6.2 millisieverts per year, a number so low it registers only in sensitive instruments and in the accumulated statistics of very large populations over very long times. This is what it costs to exist on Earth. This is the baseline. Now consider what exists on the other side of that invisible wall. In interplanetary space, in the void between planets, beyond the reach of Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere, the radiation environment is not 6.2 millisieverts per year. It is approximately 1.8 millisieverts per day, not per year, per day. To feel the weight of that difference, you need to hold both numbers at the same time. Is 6.2 per year works out to roughly 0.017 millisieverts per day on Earth's surface. In interplanetary space, the daily dose is 1.8 millisieverts, more than 100 times higher than what you absorb in a day of ordinary life. Every day of the 7-month outbound transit, the crew of a Mars mission would absorb more radiation than most people on Earth absorb in an entire month. By the time the spacecraft reaches Mars, the outbound journey alone will have delivered approximately 430 millisieverts to each person aboard. That is 70 times the annual dose of someone standing on Earth's surface. And the journey is only half over in the most literal sense. They still have to get back. But the transit is not the only exposure. Once on the Martian surface, the crew is not safe. Mars has no global magnetic field. Its atmosphere is roughly 1% as dense as Earth's, which means it provides essentially no radiation shielding. The Curiosity rover's radiation assessment detector, the RADI instrument, which was designed specifically to measure this, found that the surface of Mars delivers approximately 0.67 millisieverts per day, lower than interplanetary space because the planet itself blocks radiation coming from below, and the thin atmosphere provides marginal protection from above. But still, on a 500-day surface stay, that accumulates to approximately 335 millisieverts. On Earth, that dose, 335 millisieverts, would represent more than 50 years of normal background radiation exposure, absorbed in under 2 years. On Mars, it is simply the cost of being there, and when the crew boards the spacecraft to return, the interplanetary radiation resumes at its full intensity for another 7 months, adding hundreds more millisieverts to a body that has already absorbed more than most humans will receive in a lifetime. The total for a 3-year round-trip mission, transit out, surface stay, transit back, may exceed 1,000 millisieverts. NASA has established a career limit for astronaut radiation exposure based on a calculation of acceptable risk. The limit is set at a level corresponding to a 3% increase in the risk of exposure-induced death. That is the boundary NASA considers ethically defensible for human beings in its care. A Mars mission, according to the agency's own estimates, carries a central estimate of approximately 5% radiation-induced mortality risk, with an upper bound near 10%. The mission exceeds NASA's own career limit before the crew returns. Before they have completed the mission they were sent to complete, and they will have absorbed more radiation than the institution responsible for their safety considers acceptable over an entire career. 5%, 10% at the upper end. Sit with those numbers in a different context for a moment. If an aircraft had a 5% chance of killing you due to a known, measurable, unavoidable structural condition, not a mechanical failure, not pilot error, but a quantified physical property of the flight itself, that aircraft would never leave the ground. Every regulatory authority in the world would ground it permanently. If a nuclear facility operated with a 10% upper bound probability of fatal exposure for its workers, it would be shut down before the week was out. These are not hypothetical thresholds, and these are the standards human societies have decided represent the boundary between acceptable risk and unconscionable risk. And yet, they are considered acceptable for Mars, because there is no alternative that preserves the mission. The mission and the dose are inseparable, and here is where the assumption, the reasonable, intuitive assumption, that shielding can solve this begins to collapse. The assumption sounds reasonable. It sounds like the kind of problem engineers solve by iteration. Thicker walls, denser materials, perhaps lead lining, perhaps water walls, perhaps some material not yet developed but developable. The truth is almost precisely the opposite of what intuition suggests. The radiation that poses the greatest risk in interplanetary space is not primarily the charged particles deflected by Earth's magnetic field, the kind that ordinary shielding handles reasonably well. The dominant threat comes from galactic cosmic rays, particles originating outside the solar system, accelerated to near light speeds by ancient supernovae and other violent events in the galaxy, carrying energies so extreme that they penetrate virtually any practical thickness of shielding material with minimal attenuation. When a galactic cosmic ray strikes a spacecraft wall, aluminum, polymer, water, or anything else that might realistically be carried into space, it does not simply stop. It generates a cascade of secondary particles, as a shower of neutrons and protons and heavier fragments that can, in some configurations, deliver a higher total dose to the people inside than if the wall had not been there at all. Adding mass to stop galactic cosmic rays can, under certain conditions, make the situation worse. The engineering solution increases the biological problem. There is no known material, no practical thickness, that stops galactic cosmic rays the way a brick wall stops rain. And then there is the solar weather problem, which operates on its own schedule, entirely independent of human mission timelines. The Sun cycles through periods of high and low activity roughly every 11 years, and during periods of high solar activity, solar maximum, it also produces solar particle events, sudden, intense bursts of radiation from flares and coronal mass ejections. These events can, with hours of warning, deliver doses that overwhelm even the partial shielding spacecraft carry. In 1972, between the Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 missions, a solar storm occurred that was so intense that had any Apollo crew been in transit through interplanetary space at that moment, the radiation dose would have been lethal. There was no crew in space that day. The timing was, in the most literal sense, fortunate. In 1859, the Carrington event, the largest geomagnetic storm in recorded history, released energy that, had humans been traveling between planets at the time, would have been catastrophic. These events do not announce themselves in advance with sufficient warning to maneuver or shelter in any meaningful way. So the planned 2029 mission window falls during a period of declining solar activity moving towards solar minimum, which reduces, but does not eliminate, the solar particle event risk, while doing nothing about the galactic cosmic ray baseline, which actually increases slightly during solar minimum because the Sun's reduced activity allows more galactic particles to penetrate the inner solar system. The radiation cannot be stopped. The dose accumulates silently, invisibly, without sensation. No heat, no pain, no perception of any kind. The body does not know it is happening. The cells do not issue a warning when a high-energy particle passes through a nucleus and breaks a strand of DNA. And cancer, as devastating as it is, may not be the most urgent consequence. Because the recent research has begun to suggest that galactic cosmic radiation does something to the human body that is perhaps more immediately threatening to a mission than any tumor that might develop years after return. It appears to damage the organ the astronauts will need most of all. Not the bones, not the cardiovascular system, not the eyes, but the brain itself. And what the research has begun to reveal about what that radiation does to the brain is something that even many people closely following the Mars mission conversation have not fully absorbed. The assumption, when people discuss radiation risk in the context of a long-duration spaceflight, is almost always the same. The concern is cancer, a tumor that might develop years or decades after the mission ends. A statistical elevation in long-term mortality risk is something real, something serious, but something that belongs to the future, not to the present, not to the mission itself. The astronauts will be sharp, they will be trained and capable and decisive. The radiation might shorten their lives later, but their minds will be intact for the work. That assumption is what the animal research, conducted over the past decade, has quietly and persistently dismantled. Studies exposing rodents to simulated galactic cosmic radiation, the high-energy, high-charge particles that no practical shielding can stop, have documented persistent, measurable decrements in hippocampal and cortical performance. The hippocampus is the region most centrally involved in forming and retrieving memories. The cortex handles reasoning, planning, and the kind of structured executive function that allows a person to assess a situation, weigh options, and make a sound decision under pressure. In the animal models, both regions showed lasting damage. Not temporary disruption, lasting damage. Memory formation became less reliable. Cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt a strategy when circumstances change, declined in measurable, reproducible ways. The impairments did not resolve when the radiation exposure ended. They persisted. This is the invisible killer. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the steady accumulation of molecular errors that eventually express themselves as disease, as cognitive decline, as a mind that no longer functions as it once did. No flare, no warning signal, no moment when an alarm sounds and the astronaut understands that something has shifted. Yet the degradation is gradual, quiet, and precisely the kind of process that is almost impossible to observe from the inside, because the symptoms that accompany this kind of neurological decline are not exotic or unmistakable. They are irritability, difficulty concentrating, trouble with spatial navigation, with holding an accurate mental map of an environment and moving through it reliably, slowed reasoning, a subtle but real erosion of the executive capacity that allows a person to recognize when they are making an error and to stop and correct course. These are not symptoms that announce themselves as radiation damage. They are symptoms that announce themselves as stress, as fatigue, as the ordinary understandable strain of 7 months in a tin can followed by weeks of technical work in a hostile environment. If an astronaut on the Martian surface becomes short-tempered, their crewmates are not going to look at each other and say, "The cosmic radiation has begun to degrade prefrontal cortical function." They are going to say, "It has been a long mission. Everyone is exhausted. This is expected." And that is precisely what makes this particular form of damage so deeply, structurally dangerous to a mission that depends entirely, in every contingency, on the quality of human judgment. Think about what the mission requires at its most demanding moments: an equipment failure in the habitat, a medical emergency with no physician available beyond what the crew itself can provide, a decision about whether a surface excursion should be aborted, whether a repair is safe to attempt, or whether an unexpected reading from a sensor represents a real threat or a sensor malfunction. Every one of those situations requires rapid, accurate, flexible reasoning. Every one of them requires a person whose executive function is intact, whose memory of procedures and training is reliable, whose capacity for sound judgment has not been quietly hollowed out over the preceding months by a form of damage they cannot feel and have no way to measure in real time. The astronaut needs a sharp mind to survive. The radiation is degrading precisely that. And the cruelest part, the part that has no engineering solution and no behavioral workaround, is that the damaged organ is the one that would need to recognize its own damage. A person with a broken leg knows the leg is broken. A person with impaired executive function may believe, yes, with complete sincerity, that they are reasoning as clearly as they ever have. The degradation presents, from the inside, as nothing, as normal, as the ordinary texture of a tired mind doing hard work in a difficult environment. Their crewmates, experiencing their own gradual cognitive shifts from the same unrelenting radiation environment, may not be positioned to notice the change in someone else, not because they are inattentive, but because the change is slow, and because the baseline is shifting for everyone simultaneously, and because the symptoms look like exactly the things everyone expected to see. And we have not even discussed what Mars itself will do to them. The transit delivers its dose, and the brain arrives at its destination already changed in ways that no instrument on the spacecraft will have measured. Already operating at a margin below the peak function those astronauts demonstrated in every training simulation, every medical evaluation, every psychological screening on Earth. And then, the surface begins its own slow work. The Curiosity rover's radiation assessment detector measured the Martian surface dose at roughly 0.67 millisieverts per day. Not as intense as interplanetary transit, but continuous, unrelenting, accumulating across the months or years of the surface stay, with a Martian atmosphere too thin to offer any meaningful protection and no magnetic field to deflect the particles that the thin air fails to stop. The universe does not mean to harm us. It simply does not care whether we survive. Yes, or there is no malice in a galactic cosmic ray that was launched from a dying star thousands of years ago and has been traveling at near the speed of light ever since, carrying enough energy to pass through a spacecraft wall and a human skull and a cluster of hippocampal neurons without ever slowing down. It is not aimed. It is not directed. It is simply what the universe is made of, out there beyond the sanctuary that Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere have provided for every moment of every human life that has ever been lived. The particles do not know there is a brain in the way, and the brain does not know the particles are passing through it. The body is degrading. The brain is degrading. But there is another assault on the mind that requires no radiation at all, that requires only isolation and confinement, and the knowledge, clear and permanent and impossible to escape, that no rescue is coming. Ever. And that assault, the psychological one, is the one that most people underestimate because they trust the selection process. They know that NASA and the agencies like it do not pick astronauts carelessly. They know that every person who reaches that shortlist has been screened, evaluated, stress-tested, and observed under conditions designed to surface exactly the kind of instability that would become dangerous in a confined, high-stakes environment. And they are right to know that. The selection process is extraordinarily rigorous, and the people who survive it are, by any reasonable measure, psychologically exceptional. That belief is not wrong. It is simply insufficient for what Mars actually requires. Because what Mars requires has never been tested, not truly, and the closest we have come to testing it produced results that should give anyone pause. In 2010, a research team in Moscow began an experiment called Mars 500. 6 volunteers entered a series of interconnected modules: a simulated spacecraft, a simulated Mars habitat, a simulated return vehicle, and did not leave for 520 days. They performed mock mission tasks, maintained simulated communication delays with the outside world, ate food similar to what a real crew would carry, and attempted to replicate, as faithfully as possible, the psychological texture of a long-duration Mars mission. The experiment was a landmark. The participants were healthy, motivated, carefully selected, and by most measures functional throughout the duration. But the data that emerged from monitoring their activity levels, sleep patterns, and behavioral indicators told a more complicated story. One participant, by the end of the experiment, was spending the vast majority of his time in his bunk, not because he was ill in any diagnosable physical sense, but because the signs pointed clearly toward a state of withdrawal, disengagement, a kind of settling inward that looked, to the researchers reviewing the data, like depression. He was not incapacitated. He was not dangerous. He simply was not there in any meaningful sense, present in the module but absent from the mission, moving through the days at the minimum necessary level of engagement. And here is the thing you have to hold on to when you consider that finding. He knew he was in Moscow. The door at the end of the corridor, at the one they were not supposed to open, led to the outside world. Help was not 48 million kilometers away at minimum transit. It was outside. He could have knocked on the wall and someone would have answered. The isolation was simulated. The confinement was real, but bounded by a frame that everyone involved understood was temporary and artificial. And still, across 520 days, the psychological weight of a small space and a constrained social world and a reduced sense of agency was enough to pull one participant into a state of functional withdrawal. The Mars 500 experiment was designed to produce optimistic results, to demonstrate human adaptability, and it still surfaced this. The Antarctic winter-over research runs in a similar direction. Our researchers and support staff who spend extended periods at stations in Antarctica, genuinely isolated, genuinely confined to small structures in an environment hostile to outdoor activity for months at a time, develop a cluster of symptoms so reliably that researchers gave it a name: the winter-over syndrome. Irritability rises, cognitive performance declines, depression rates increase, interpersonal tension accumulates in ways that the small, enclosed social world of the station cannot easily absorb or release. And Antarctic crews have something that a Mars crew does not. They have the knowledge that a plane could, eventually, come for them, that the isolation is seasonal, that there is an end to the calendar, a date circled somewhere in the mind beyond which normal life resumes. Yes, the psychological weight of confinement is dramatically affected by whether it has a defined and reliable exit. Take away the exit, and the weight becomes something else entirely. Imagine a room, not a large room, perhaps the size of a studio apartment, and imagine that you cannot leave that room for 3 years, not because the door is locked, but because outside the door is an atmosphere of carbon dioxide at 1% of Earth's pressure, and a temperature that will kill you in minutes. And the next environment that will not kill you is somewhere between 55 million kilometers and 400 million kilometers away, depending on where the two planets happen to be in their orbits. Imagine waking up in that room every morning. Imagine every meal in that room, every difficult conversation, every moment of frustration, every need for solitude, every need for genuine new human contact, all of it contained within the same walls, the same corridors, the same faces, and your crewmates are in the same room, experiencing the same compression, with nowhere to go when the friction between people becomes the kind of friction that, on Earth, you would resolve by simply leaving, by taking a walk, by calling someone who is not in the situation, by sleeping somewhere different for a few nights. On Mars, you cannot leave, and neither can they. Antarctic research also documents what happens to group dynamics in isolated, confined environments over time, how minor irritations calcify into genuine resentments, how the same idiosyncrasies that were tolerable in month 2 become unbearable by month 6, and how the absence of new social input means the same interpersonal patterns replay themselves in an ever-tightening loop. Antarctic crews have evacuation protocols. A crew member experiencing a mental health crisis can, at significant logistical difficulty, be extracted. A Mars crew has no such option. If someone fractures, if the psychological pressure becomes more than a person can carry, and the result is a full crisis, psychosis, acute depression, a breakdown of the kind that requires psychiatric hospitalization, there is no facility to transfer them to, no therapist to bring in, no medication beyond whatever finite supply was loaded before departure, no evacuation that is physically possible for the better part of 2 years at minimum. A mental health crisis on Mars does not become a personal tragedy, yet it becomes an existential threat to everyone in the habitat, because the crew is small enough, and the tasks are critical enough, and the social environment is enclosed enough that one person's psychological collapse reverberates through every system. Researchers who study long-duration space missions have documented a phenomenon called autonomization, in which ISS crews gradually become less communicative with mission control over the course of extended stays. Not out of hostility, but out of a kind of adaptive drawing inward, a psychological circling of the wagons around the small world that is actually present, and a quiet distancing from the larger world that exists only as a voice through a radio. Mission Control notices it. Crews on 6-month ISS rotations show it in measurable ways. A crew on a 3-year Mars mission, it operating under communication, delays that make real conversation impossible, would have far less reason to maintain the connective tissue of that relationship with Earth. And then there is what happens to the relationships that existed before departure. The ISS crew member has been gone for months and returns. The Mars colonist will not return. And the people they left behind will understand, eventually, that the version of that person they knew, the person who existed inside a normal human social world, who could share a meal, or sit in comfortable silence, or be called at 2 a.m, is gone in a way that has no good word for it. Not dead, not estranged, simply unreachable in any form that human intimacy depends upon. A child born before departure grows up while 40 minutes of radio delay sits between every exchange. That child's parent becomes, year by year, something closer to a correspondence than a presence. The colonist watches, through delayed video, and a life that continues without them. Birthday parties attended by a slightly older version of a face they last touched with their hands more than a year ago. Milestones transmitted as recordings that are already history by the time they arrive. The pale blue dot hanging in the Martian sky, carrying everything and everyone they have ever loved, compressed now into a single point of dim light that even a telescope cannot resolve into anything recognizable. They will grieve alone on an alien world while life on Earth continues without them. There is no pivot here, no solution to offer, just the weight of that reality. Sitting in a studio apartment at the bottom of a gravity well they cannot climb out of, processing a loss that has no ceremony and no end. The body degrades, the brain is irradiated. Yes, the mind bends under pressures that have broken subjects in controlled experiments who knew, at every moment, that help was just outside the door. This is what the destination costs. But at least the destination itself, the planet, the surface, the vast and rust-colored alien world that has captured human imagination for a century, at least Mars offers something to work with. A new world, a canvas, something unprecedented and vast and worth exploring. Perhaps, after everything, that is what makes the cost worth bearing. Perhaps it is time to look at what that new world actually is. Mars is beautiful in photographs. The rust-colored plains stretch to a curved horizon under a salmon-tinted sky. The craters are ancient and vast. The volcanoes rise to heights that dwarf anything on Earth. And if you came across one of those photographs without knowing what you were looking at, you might think you were looking at something survivable, harsh. Yes, the way a high desert is harsh. The way a mountain range is harsh. The kind of harsh that a person with the right equipment and the right preparation could move through and endure. The photographs lie by omission. They show you the scenery without telling you a single thing about the environment, and those two words, scenery and environment, describe utterly different realities on the surface of Mars. The atmosphere presses down on the Martian surface at 6 millibars. Earth's atmosphere, standing at sea level, presses down at 1013 millibars. That comparison requires a moment, because the raw numbers can slip past without registering. Is 6 against 1013 means that the air pressure on the surface of Mars is less than 1% of what you are breathing right now. The room you are sitting in has more than 100 times the atmospheric pressure of the entire Martian surface. You could not stand in that air. You could not even call it air in any sense your lungs would recognize. Human lungs are built to work within a fairly narrow range of pressures, and 6 millibars sits so far below that range that the word thin does not apply. The word for 6 millibars of atmospheric pressure, when you are a human being standing in it, is vacuum. Not the vacuum of deep space, but close enough that the distinction stops mattering to the soft tissues of your body. The gases dissolved in your blood, the fluids in your joints, or the moisture in your lungs, they would all begin to vaporize at body temperature, because the atmospheric pressure is so low that the boiling point of water drops below 37 degrees Celsius. Your blood would boil while your heart was still beating. Your lungs, trying to draw breath, would rupture on the expansion. You would lose consciousness in approximately 15 seconds, not from suffocation, but from the pressure differential alone, and you would be dead before anyone in a habitat 50 meters away could reach you, assuming they did not open the airlock to try. And the composition of what passes for atmosphere on Mars compounds this in ways that almost seem redundant, given that the pressure alone is lethal. 96% of the Martian atmosphere is carbon dioxide, less than 3% is nitrogen. Oxygen exists in traces, approximately 0.13%, which is to say, for practical purposes, there is none. For context, carbon dioxide concentrations in an enclosed room on Earth become noticeable to occupants at around 1%, triggering headaches and confusion. Above 5%, cognitive impairment becomes significant. Above 10%, a person loses consciousness. Above 20%, death follows within minutes. The Martian atmosphere is 96% carbon dioxide. This is not a marginal deficiency in oxygen. This is an atmosphere that would kill a person who breathed it for reasons entirely separate from the pressure problem, layered on top of the pressure problem, layered on top of the temperature. The average surface temperature on Mars is negative 60 degrees Celsius. Not the record low, and not the polar winter extreme, the average, across the whole planet, across all seasons. Negative 60 degrees Celsius is colder than any permanently inhabited location on Earth. It is colder than the interior of Antarctica in midwinter, and that is the average. In polar regions during winter, the temperature drops to negative 125 degrees Celsius, cold enough that carbon dioxide, the primary component of the atmosphere itself, begins to freeze out of the sky and precipitate onto the surface as dry ice. Even at the equator, in the warmest part of the warmest day of the Martian year, the temperature barely reaches 0 degrees Celsius before plunging back below freezing after sunset. There is no temperate zone on Mars. There is no comfortable latitude where the temperatures, while cold, fall within a range that Earth biology has encountered and adapted to. The entire planet is colder than the coldest places humans have ever tried to build permanent settlements, and those settlements on Earth, Antarctic research stations, high-altitude outposts, can be evacuated. They are cold but not permanently sealed. Mars does not want colonists dead in any intentional sense. The planet simply exists as it has for billions of years, indifferent to the biological requirements of the creatures now considering a visit. The planet is also, in ways the photographs cannot convey, genuinely immense. Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system, rises 22 kilometers above the surrounding plain, more than 2.5 times the height of Mount Everest, tall enough that its peak sits above most of the Martian atmosphere, which was already nearly non-existent. And Valles Marineris, the Great Canyon system that cuts across the Martian equatorial region, runs 4,000 kilometers from end to end. If you placed one end of Valles Marineris on the Atlantic coast of the United States and traced it westward, the other end would reach past Los Angeles and into the Pacific Ocean. The canyon would span the entire continental United States, and it would not quite fit. These are not features that colonists will explore at leisure. They are features of a world whose scale is alien in ways that go beyond the aesthetic, because every kilometer of that world exists under a sky that will kill you in under a minute if your suit fails, over soil that contains a hazard so insidious it took decades of robotic exploration to detect. In 2008, a NASA's Phoenix lander touched down near the Martian North Pole and performed the first chemical analysis of Martian soil in a region that had never been sampled before. Among the compounds Phoenix detected were perchlorates, oxidizing salts that occur naturally on Mars at concentrations between 0.5 and 1% of the soil by mass. This sounds like a chemistry problem, and it is, but it is also a contamination problem of a scale that has no real equivalent in the history of human exploration. On Earth, perchlorates are classified as hazardous waste. They are produced as industrial byproducts. They accumulate in groundwater, and their remediation at contaminated sites costs billions of dollars and takes decades. On Mars, they are in every handful of soil, everywhere, are uniformly distributed by billions of years of atmospheric chemistry. A person working on the Martian surface, fixing a solar panel, repairing a habitat seal, doing any of the routine physical labor that a colony would require, would generate dust. Martian dust gets into everything, the way fine silica dust gets into the lungs of miners and causes silicosis, except that Martian dust also carries perchlorates, which the body cannot process, which disrupt thyroid function at even low doses, and which at higher chronic exposures cause far worse. There is no safe version of breathing Martian dust. There is no filtration system that can be trusted absolutely. There is no procedure that eliminates the contamination risk entirely, because the dust is too fine, too pervasive, and too chemically active to be treated as a manageable nuisance. And then the dust itself, independent of its chemistry, demonstrates what Mars is capable of as an environment. In 2018, a global dust storm engulfed the entire planet, reducing sunlight at the surface to levels too low to power the solar panels of the Opportunity rover, which had operated successfully for 14 years and was still functioning when the storm killed it by cutting off its power. Opportunity could not call for help. It could not be retrieved. It sat on the surface until its batteries drained and its electronics froze. And that was the end of one of the most successful planetary missions in the history of space exploration. A global dust storm on Mars is not a local weather event. It is a planetary event that can last for months, and that no current technology can do anything to prevent or even reliably predict. A colony dependent on solar power, and any early colony would be, because nuclear power on that scale has never been demonstrated there, would face the possibility of a months-long power shortage with no rescue available and no external support to call upon. The Martian day runs 24 hours and 37 minutes, which is close enough to an Earth day that circadian rhythms would not be dramatically disrupted. This is, genuinely, one small comfort among a catalogue of hostilities that leaves almost no room for any. Living on Mars means living inside machines, forever, never touching the world you inhabit directly, and never stepping outside without layers of engineered protection between you and the planet you chose. This is not frontier life, the kind of frontier life that fills the cultural imagination with images of settlers building homes with their hands, cultivating land, being shaped by their landscape through direct physical contact with it. This is existence inside a perpetual life support system, where the act of breathing requires equipment, where the soil beneath your feet is toxic, where the sky above you is lethal, and where the most routine human relationship with the natural world, stepping outside, feeling air on your face, hearing wind without a helmet, is permanently impossible. Every instinct says there must be a way back. Every narrative of exploration includes the return journey. But the mathematics of spaceflight recognizes no narrative. It recognizes only mass, velocity, and the merciless exponential function that governs both. It recognizes only mass, velocity, and the merciless exponential function that governs both. And the exponential function that governs the return journey is the place where most people's assumptions about Mars, that it is a problem of funding, of will, of engineering ambition, large enough to match the challenge, quietly collapse under the weight of arithmetic that does not negotiate. Here is the equation, stated as plainly as possible. Every kilogram of anything you want to have on the surface of Mars requires launching somewhere between 7 and 11 kilograms from the surface of Earth, because of the fuel required to escape Earth's gravity, achieve orbit, conduct the interplanetary transit, and then slow down enough to land. That ratio, 7 to 11 to 1, already makes the economics of getting to Mars almost incomprehensible. But that is the ratio for equipment, for food, for habitat components, for anything with mass that you want to carry as cargo. When you need to bring propellant specifically, not cargo, but the fuel that a return vehicle would burn to lift off Mars and get home, the ratio becomes something different in kind, not just in scale. To land 1 kilogram of usable propellant on the surface of Mars, you have to launch 226 kilograms from Earth, 226 to 1, not because of any engineering failure or inefficiency that could be corrected. Yes, because of the compounding mathematics of getting fuel to a place that requires fuel to reach, using fuel that itself had to be carried there by more fuel, which in turn required more fuel to lift it off the ground in the first place. Fuel to carry the fuel that carries the fuel. Each layer multiplies the previous one, and the multiplication never stops working against you. Try to feel that ratio in physical terms. A starship, which is the most capable launch vehicle ever seriously developed for this purpose, aims to lift roughly 150,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit. That is an enormous amount of mass, the weight of roughly 105 adult male African elephants. Yet if you need something living to anchor the number, and it represents the practical ceiling of what a single launch of the most powerful reusable rocket ever designed can deliver. Now, consider that a starship attempting to return from Mars needs somewhere in the range of 33,000 kilograms of propellant just to climb from the Martian surface to Mars orbit. That is the minimum for the ascent phase alone. The total propellant requirement for the full return journey, including the journey home, could exceed 100,000 kilograms. And at 226 kilograms launched from Earth for every 1 kilogram available on Mars, providing that fuel from Earth would require launching more than 22 million kilograms from our planet's surface. The Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown, had the vehicle that carried human beings to the moon, could lift approximately 130,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit. Supplying the return fuel from Earth, under this arithmetic, would require roughly 170 Saturn V launches worth of propellant alone, before you have launched a single human being, or a single gram of food, or a single piece of equipment. The mathematics does not care about ambition or courage or how much we want to go home. It cares about mass, and the mass required is not expensive. It is physically impossible at any scale that honest engineering can contemplate. So the only alternative, and it has always been the only alternative anyone seriously proposes, is to make the fuel on Mars. This is what is called in situ resource utilization, and in principle, the chemistry is not exotic. Mars has an atmosphere that is 96% carbon dioxide, and if you can find or extract hydrogen from water ice, from the thin Martian air, you can run what is called the Sabatier reaction. Carbon dioxide combined with hydrogen yields methane and water. Methane is a rocket propellant. Oxygen, separated from water or from the carbon dioxide itself, is the oxidizer that burns it. The chemistry is genuinely understood. No one disputes that the reaction works. The question is whether it can be made to work at the scale required, on a planet where no industrial infrastructure of any kind currently exists, operating reliably for years without the ability to be serviced by anyone with the expertise to fix it when something fails. Now, the best data point we have for answering that question is a device called MOXIE, the Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization Experiment, which flew aboard the Perseverance rover and successfully produced oxygen from the Martian atmosphere. This was a genuine achievement, and the people who built it deserve full credit for demonstrating that the principle works in actual Martian conditions rather than just in a laboratory on Earth. MOXIE produced approximately 12 grams of oxygen per hour. 12 grams. A return vehicle needs tens of thousands of kilograms of liquid oxygen, combined with tens of thousands of kilograms of liquid methane. both of which must be stored cryogenically. Methane stays liquid only below negative 161 degrees Celsius, and oxygen only below negative 183 degrees Celsius for months or years in a harsh and unpredictable environment, without any leakage that would bleed the supply away before the crew ever boards the vehicle. 12 grams per hour versus tens of thousands of kilograms. If you wanted to fill an Olympic swimming pool with water using a common kitchen eyedropper, you would be working for roughly 6,000 years. The gap between MOXIE and an operational Mars propellant plant is not a step on a continuous path of engineering progress. It is a gap of multiple orders of magnitude in production scale, combined with the requirement for industrial reliability over multi-year timescales, combined with the complete absence of any repair infrastructure if the system fails, combined with the cryogenic storage problem for which no zero boil-off solution has ever been demonstrated at scale. And we have not even asked whether they can come home. We are still trying to establish whether it is physically possible to create the fuel that would make the question worth asking. The fuel problem is merely the most dramatic of a series of technology gaps, each of which must be solved not adequately, not approximately, but perfectly, because on Mars there is no margin for imperfection, and no one coming to correct it if something falls short. And the word perfectly, when you begin to examine what it actually demands, carries a weight that deserves very careful examination. And the word perfectly, as we established, that demands a kind of examination that most optimistic discussions of Mars colonization quietly decline to perform. So, let us perform it. Let us take each technology that must work, not adequately, not approximately, but without catastrophic failure for years on end, and look at it directly, without the soft lighting of aspiration. Start with the question of how you get there in the first place, not the transit through space, which we have already spent considerable time with, but the final act of arrival, slowing a vehicle from interplanetary velocity to a complete stop on the Martian surface. The heaviest object ever successfully landed on Mars is the Perseverance rover, which weighed approximately 1 metric ton. 1 metric ton is a substantial machine. The rover is roughly the size of a small car, bristling with instruments. At the product of years of engineering at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and landing it safely required a sequence of maneuvers so audacious that the engineers called it the 7 minutes of terror. A parachute, a heat shield, a rocket-powered sky crane lowering the rover on cables to the surface. It worked. It was a triumph, and Perseverance weighed 1 metric ton. A crewed mission to Mars, carrying the habitats and life support equipment, and food and fuel production hardware, and everything else that human survival requires, would need to land somewhere between 50 and 100 metric tons. Think about what that ratio means in physical terms. If Perseverance is a motorcycle, a heavy, sophisticated, expensive motorcycle, then a crewed mission is a fully loaded semi-truck, including the trailer, including the cargo, and including the fuel. And we have demonstrated exactly zero capability to land anything resembling a semi-truck on Mars, because the technique that gets a motorcycle down safely does not scale. The Martian atmosphere is too thin for parachutes to do enough work. It provides about 1% of the braking force you would get from Earth's atmosphere, but it is not thin enough to be ignored, because at the speeds involved, supersonic retropropulsion, firing rocket engines against your direction of travel to slow yourself down, generates what the engineers describe as shock fronts, violent pressure waves that interact with the vehicle's aerodynamics in ways that have never been tested in actual Martian conditions. A chief engineer at JPL described these shock fronts as something that could, and his language was precise, whack the vehicle. A whack is not a term engineers typically deploy when discussing controlled flight dynamics. It is the word you use when you are describing a force that can end the mission in an instant, that comes from the interaction of variables you do not fully understand, in an environment you cannot fully replicate from a distance of 225 million kilometers. Nobody has solved this problem. The architecture that would land 50 metric tons safely on Mars does not exist as a tested, validated system. It exists as a proposal, as a simulation, as a project with a funding line that may or may not survive the next budget cycle. But suppose we grant the landing. Suppose we set aside the physics of arrival and ask what happens once the crew is on the surface and the doors of the habitat are sealed against an atmosphere that is 96% carbon dioxide, at a pressure so low that the air in the room you are sitting in contains more than 100 times the atmospheric pressure outside any habitat on Mars. The crew must now live inside a closed system, breathing recycled air and drinking recycled water, and depending on machinery to maintain the precise balance of gases that allows consciousness and then life to continue. No such system has ever sustained humans for the duration a Mars mission demands. The longest crewed space missions approach a year in low Earth orbit. It's with regular supply missions from the ground and the ability to return within hours in an emergency. A Mars mission is categorically different, and we know this in part because we tried to build a closed life support system on Earth, not in space, but here, with unlimited engineering resources and the ability to walk outside and fix things. And it failed. Biosphere 2 was constructed in the Arizona desert in the early 1990s, a sealed glass and steel structure meant to house 8 people in a completely closed ecological system. It was a serious scientific enterprise, not a stunt. The people who designed it understood atmospheric chemistry and ecology and the difficulty of the problem they were attempting. The experiment ran from 1991 to 1993, and within months, the oxygen levels inside began dropping in ways the designers had not predicted. Microbes in the soil were consuming oxygen faster than the plants could regenerate it. Carbon dioxide levels climbed. Nitrous oxide accumulated. The crew experienced the cognitive effects of low oxygen, the same slow dimming we described earlier, the kind that feels like fatigue rather than danger. And eventually, oxygen had to be pumped in from outside, which ended the closed system integrity of the experiment entirely. This happened on Earth with unlimited support, with the ability to open the doors. We hope, we theorize, we run simulations. We conduct analog missions in places like the Arctic and the Hawaiian volcanic highlands. But no human has ever attempted to survive on another planet for years with no resupply from Earth, and the experiment has never been run. And then there is the question of feeding whoever survives the landing and the atmosphere. Each person needs approximately 2,000 calories per day to maintain basic function, and that number climbs during physical labor, which surface operations on Mars will unavoidably involve. A crew of 12 people requires 8.7 million calories per year. That number is not a rounding error or a back-of-envelope estimate. It is straightforward multiplication, and it represents an agricultural and food production challenge of extraordinary difficulty in an environment where the soil contains perchlorates toxic to human consumption, where growing seasons cannot be interrupted by equipment failure, where ultraviolet radiation would sterilize any surface crops left unshielded, and where the power required to maintain grow lights and temperature and atmospheric control in enclosed farming structures must come from somewhere continuously. The Kilopower nuclear reactor project, developed by NASA, represents a promising approach to surface power generation and has shown real progress in testing, but a promising approach in testing and a proven, multi-year, continuously reliable power source on Mars are not the same category of thing, and conflating them is a habit that optimism encourages, and engineering cannot afford. And medicine. Consider what happens on a crew of 12 people, 350 days into a surface stay, when the single physician on the mission develops appendicitis. And the surgery to remove an inflamed appendix is routine by Earth standards, performed tens of thousands of times each year, rarely fatal in settings with proper resources. But on Mars, the physician in the operating theatre is also the patient. The next nearest surgeon is 45 minutes away in round-trip communication time, which means no real-time guidance, no second opinion arriving before the decision must be made, no evacuation. The crew must perform the surgery themselves, on their only doctor, using whatever resources the mission included, with training that, however extensive, stops well short of surgical residency for every member of a crew selected primarily for other skills. This is not an unlikely scenario constructed to make the mission sound dangerous, and it is a representative example of the class of medical emergency that a multi-year surface mission is statistically certain to encounter. Now hold all of these systems in your mind at once: the landing architecture, the closed life support, the food production, the medical capability, the fuel production, the radiation shielding, the psychological sustainability. Assume that each of these systems, once deployed, functions correctly 9 times out of 10. 90% reliability sounds high. It sounds like something an engineer would be proud of. But when you multiply the probability of success across sequential systems that all must function for the mission to survive, the arithmetic is implacable. 90% times 90% is 81%. Times 90% again is 72.9%. Times 90% again is 65.6%. And we have described not 4 systems, but something closer to a dozen, each with its own internal failure modes, each dependent on the others. The cumulative probability of everything working approaches a number that no responsible engineering program would accept. And we are not discussing systems that have been refined over decades of operational experience. We are discussing systems that have never been fully tested in the environment where they must perform. Consider that NASA's Mars Sample Return mission, a program designed to bring back a few kilograms of rocks, not sustain human life, was cancelled after costs escalated into the billions of dollars without a single gram of Martian soil returning to Earth. A few kilograms of rocks, with no humans involved, no life support, no food, no medicine, no return crew. Billions of dollars cancelled. And the systems required to keep 12 people alive on Mars for years make the sample return architecture look, by comparison, like a relatively modest engineering undertaking. The technology does not exist. Not in a funding problem sense, not in a political will sense, in the literal sense that no human has ever demonstrated, in the environment where it matters, that these things can be made to work. And yet, here is the fact that undoes the conclusion you have almost certainly arrived at by now. In 2012, a Dutch entrepreneur named Bas Lansdorp announced a plan to send human beings to Mars on an explicit one-way mission, not a round trip with return logistics to be worked out later, and not a temporary surface stay followed by a voyage home, a permanent, irreversible relocation to another planet, with no architecture for return, no promise of rescue, no ambiguity about what was being offered. Lansdorp called the project Mars One, and he asked the people of Earth a simple question. Knowing all of this, would you go? More than 200,000 people said yes. That number deserves to be held at arm's length for a moment, because it is easy to hear and immediately begin explaining it away, to assume that the applicants must have been naive or reckless, or perhaps not fully aware of what they were signing up for. But the selection process Mars One ran was not brief or superficial. It involved multiple rounds of evaluation, medical screening, psychological assessment, and eventually the narrowing of the global pool to 100 finalists. 100 people who had survived every filter the program applied, and who still, on the other side of all of it, wanted to go. These were not people who filled out a form in 5 minutes without reading the fine print. They were people who read the fine print, understood it, and signed anyway. Consider who some of them were. Aaron Ham was 29 years old when he applied, a hotel manager from the American Midwest, not a fighter pilot or a test engineer, not someone whose professional identity was built around risk and physical extremity. He had a life, a career, a future in front of him by every conventional measure, and he looked at a one-way ticket to a planet where survival was uncertain and life expectancy was unknown. And he decided that he wanted that more than the alternative. Layla Zucker was 45, a married emergency room physician, someone who had spent her career inside the machinery of medicine, who understood in precise clinical terms what the human body can and cannot survive, who knew what a 50-50 chance of living through 2 years on Mars actually means when you translate it out of probability and into reality. She accepted that odds. She was a finalist. She wanted to go. These are not people who made their decision from a position of desperation. They were not fleeing poverty or persecution or lives without exits. They had options. They had professions. They had people who loved them and who would grieve their departure. And they chose Mars anyway, not because they misunderstood what it would cost them, but, by every available account, because they understood it completely and found the transaction acceptable. When researchers examined the psychological profiles of Mars One applicants and finalists, the patterns that emerged were not profiles of instability or pathology. They were not finding people with a death wish or a damaged relationship with their own survival. What they found were people who scored unusually high on openness to experience, on tolerance for ambiguity, and on something psychologists call self-transcendence, a quality that describes the degree to which a person understands their own life as meaningful in relation to something larger than themselves, something that extends beyond the boundaries of their individual comfort and survival. These three traits, appearing together in that configuration, are not exotic. They are not rare pathologies. They are the same psychological profile that appears again and again across the history of human expansion. In the people who crossed land bridges into unknown continents, in the people who climbed onto wooden ships when the map simply said nothing beyond a certain line, in the people who walked into deserts and polar winters and mountain ranges that had already killed others before them. We do not look back at those people and conclude that they were irrational. We do not say that the Polynesian navigators who crossed open ocean in canoes were suffering from a cognitive error. We recognize, from the distance of history, yes, that the trait that drives human beings into uninhabitable places is not a malfunction of reason, but one of its most distinctive expressions: the capacity to evaluate the cost of an experience, determine that it is worth paying, and pay it without demanding guarantees that the ledger will balance in your favor. Consider mountain climbing, which kills people regularly and systematically, on peaks that have claimed lives for generations, and which continues to attract highly educated, professionally accomplished individuals who are under no illusion about the dangers involved. We do not prevent them. We do not declare that their willingness to climb constitutes evidence of diminished capacity or poor judgment. We recognize, even when we would not make the same choice ourselves, that there is something being expressed in the act of climbing that cannot be reduced to risk miscalculation. The mountain climber who has read the accident reports, spoken to survivors, and still laces up their boots on the morning of the ascent is not failing to understand the situation. They are making a statement about what they believe a life is for. The 200,000 people who applied to Mars One were making the same kind of statement, at a scale that is difficult to absorb quietly. Mars One went bankrupt in 2019 without ever launching a mission, without ever landing hardware on Martian soil, and the 100 finalists it had selected were left holding a promise that the organization could not keep. The mission dissolved. The applicants remained. And what remains alongside them, unresolved, is the fact of their willingness, which was real, which was documented, which was not contingent on the program's survival. Something in human nature responds to the call, even when the call means permanent exile. That fact deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed as irrationality or ignorance. SpaceX frames its Mars missions as round trips, and it is worth noting that the return, as this argument has traced carefully, depends entirely on fuel production systems that have never been demonstrated at scale in the Martian environment. Whether or not the architecture is labeled as one way, the practical reality for the people who go first is not so different from what Layla Zucker and Aaron Ham were accepting when they applied. The question is no longer whether the costs are real. The costs are real. The question that remains, the one that the engineering inventory cannot answer, the one that 200,000 volunteers seem to have already answered for themselves, is whether those costs make the journey worth refusing, or whether they are precisely the kind of costs that make the journey worth choosing. The argument is complete. The evidence has been presented. The costs have been catalogued with precision and without mercy. What remains is the simplest and most difficult question of all, not whether the journey is dangerous, because it is, and not whether the return is guaranteed, because it is not, but whether any of that is the right framework for deciding whether to go. And the answer to that depends entirely on something the engineering reports cannot measure and the radiation dosimetry cannot quantify, which is what you believe a human life is fundamentally for. There are, at minimum, 3 ways to answer that question, and they lead to 3 completely different verdicts about Mars colonization, and none of them is obviously wrong. If the primary value of a human life is its length, if the measure of a life well lived is the number of years it contains, the quantity of mornings and meals and ordinary afternoons accumulated across decades, then sending people to Mars is a tragedy by definition. The radiation exposure alone pushes the probability of fatal cancer well beyond what any space agency currently authorizes as acceptable. The body that arrives on Mars after 7 months in microgravity is measurably diminished relative to the body that departed Earth, and the body that lives for years under 38% of Earth's gravity, breathing recycled air in a pressurized habitat surrounded by a toxic atmosphere barely 1% as dense as the one it evolved for, is a body being asked to operate at the outer edge of its biological tolerance for the duration of its remaining life. If years are the currency, Mars is an extraordinarily expensive proposition, and the exchange rate is not favorable. The person who goes will almost certainly have fewer years than the person who stays, and that is not speculation. It follows directly from every measurement taken across every long-duration mission that human beings have flown. If the primary value of a human life is comfort and security, if what we are trying to maximize is safety, predictability, access to good medical care, for proximity to the people we love, the small reliable pleasures of a stable existence, then Mars colonization is not a tragedy, but something closer to madness. There is no comfort on Mars. There is no security. There is a habitat that must maintain pressure against an atmosphere that would kill you in seconds if it failed. A food supply dependent on systems that have never been tested at scale in a real Martian environment. A communication link with a round-trip delay so long that any emergency will be resolved or fatal before Earth can respond. And a distance from everything familiar so vast that the homesickness alone was shown in simulation studies to be one of the most significant threats to long-duration mission performance. If security is the standard, Mars fails so comprehensively that the conversation barely needs to happen. Yeah, but there is a third framework, and it is the one that the volunteers seem to be operating from, the one that their psychological profiles point toward when researchers note that they scored exceptionally high on openness to experience, on tolerance for ambiguity, and on what psychologists call self-transcendence, the orientation towards something larger than oneself, the capacity to locate meaning not in personal comfort or personal longevity, but in participation in something that extends beyond the boundaries of a single life. And when you apply that framework to the Mars question, the calculation does not just shift slightly, it reverses completely. Approximately 70,000 years ago, a group of human beings left the African continent. We do not know exactly how many of them there were, or precisely what drove them. Yes, but we know that they crossed into territory that no member of their species had ever entered, that they had no guarantee of survival, that they were leaving behind the only landscape their ancestors had ever known, and that the journey they began eventually produced every human being alive on Earth outside of Africa today. Every civilization that emerged outside that original homeland traces its existence to the willingness of those early people to walk into the unknown and keep walking. They were not foolish. They were not confused about the risks. They were expressing something that appears to be woven into the structure of the species itself, an orientation toward the horizon that cannot be fully explained by resource scarcity or evolutionary pressure alone, because it persists even when the current territory is adequate, even when the known world is sufficient, even when the rational case for staying is overwhelming. Every frontier expansion in recorded history has involved volunteers who accepted an elevated probability of death as the cost of participation. The settlers who crossed oceans, the expeditions that pushed into polar regions, the pioneers who moved into landscapes with no infrastructure and no rescue, all of them understood, at some level, that they were accepting terms that the people who stayed behind were not, and we do not, from our vantage point in history, conclude that they were wrong. The case SpaceX makes, the case that Elon Musk has made repeatedly in the framing of the Mars mission, is not primarily an engineering argument, though it is dressed in engineering language. Yet the underlying argument is that a species confined to a single planet is a species one catastrophic event away from extinction, and that extinction is final, in a way that individual death simply is not. An asteroid of sufficient size, a supervolcanic eruption at the scale of what the geological record shows has happened before, a pandemic moving through a globally connected population with no isolated reservoir of survivors. Any of these could, in a geological eye blink, end not just human lives, but the entire human project. Every piece of music and mathematics and memory and meaning that the species has accumulated across its entire existence. A species that dies leaves no one to mourn it. There is no recovery from extinction the way there is recovery from even the most devastating wars or plagues, because recovery requires survivors, and extinction by definition produces none. If you accept that framework, if you believe that the continuation of the human species across deep time is a value worth weighing alongside the comfort and longevity of the individuals who would bear the cost of establishing that continuity, then the volunteers who scored high on self-transcendence are not confused about their priorities. They have simply placed the species above themselves in the hierarchy of what matters, and history suggests that is not an irrational place to put it. The climber who has read every accident report and still reaches for the summit on a cold morning is not failing to understand what climbing costs. We celebrate the summit and mourn the lost, and we do not say the attempt was meaningless because some attempts do not return. What we say, eventually, is that the mountains were climbed, that the maps were made, that the passage was found, and that those things happened because specific human beings decided that the cost was worth paying before anyone could guarantee that it was. The volunteers who applied to Mars 1, who scored high on exactly the traits that psychologists associate with the historical frontier temperament, who accepted with clear eyes that the probability of a short and difficult life was embedded in the application, were not making a mistake about the facts. They were making a statement about the value hierarchy, about what belongs at the top of it, about what a life spent in the service of something permanent and larger than oneself is worth compared to a life spent in the accumulation of safe and comfortable years. And the listener who finds that statement incomprehensible and the listener who finds it noble are both responding honestly, because the answer depends not on the evidence, but on the framework they bring to it. The evidence does not change. The radiation is still real, and the bone loss is still real. The distance is still real. But whether those facts constitute a verdict depends entirely on what you believe the facts are being weighed against. And that is not a question the engineering can answer, and not a question this argument will answer for you. So we arrive at the place where the argument has been pointing all along, and it is not a verdict, it is a threshold. And beyond that threshold, three paths diverge, and no one standing on Earth today can tell you which one the first colonists will walk. Picture the one who thrives. She wakes in the early Martian morning, her body adjusted now to a day that runs 24 hours and 37 minutes, to gravity that pulls at her with just over a third the force she was born into, to air that arrives through a system she has learned to trust. Not because she is naive, but because she has inspected every seal and memorized every contingency and knows the machine, the way a sailor knows the rigging of a ship that has kept them alive across open water. She pulls on her suit with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done it thousands of times, and she walks out into a landscape that is rust-red and vast and utterly indifferent to her presence, and she makes her way to the greenhouse. It is a modest structure by any Earth standard, a pressurized tunnel of translucent material anchored against the Martian wind. But inside it, under grow lights calibrated to mimic a spectrum the plants remember from a planet 400 million kilometers away, something green is growing from Martian soil, and not soil that was carried from Earth, soil that was taken from this planet, processed and amended, and coaxed into something capable of holding life. She kneels and runs her fingers along a stem, and the green is improbable against everything this world has done to resist it, against the perch laurites laced through the regolith at concentrations that would poison an unprotected crop, against the cold that would freeze liquid water on an unheated surface in minutes, against the radiation that falls from a sky with no magnetic field to deflect it. And still, the green is there. She does not weep because she is not someone who weeps easily, but she understands in this moment that the thing she is looking at is the entire argument made visible, the case that the distance and the bone loss and the radiation and the fuel that cannot exist in sufficient quantities to bring her home are all acceptable costs, because what she is building here is something that has never existed before. She understands this is what the 200,000 people who raised their hands and said yes were imagining when they raised them. But there is another colonist, and his story does not have that morning. His body absorbed the radiation across the transit, and it continued absorbing it on the surface, and by the third year, the cumulative dose has begun to express itself in ways that the pre-mission medical models predicted but could not prevent. In NASA's own estimates place the elevated mortality risk from radiation exposure at somewhere between 5 and 10% for a mission of this duration, not as a remote statistical abstraction, but as a real and individual probability carried inside each body that makes the journey. He develops fatigue that does not respond to rest, and then symptoms that the crew physician recognizes from the literature and cannot fully treat with the pharmacological inventory available in a pressurized habitat on a planet with no resupply coming for another 2 years. He continues working because the work is the only thing that gives the suffering a shape he can bear. He calibrates instruments. He runs atmospheric readings. He writes detailed logs that he knows will inform every mission that comes after. And he understands that this is its own form of contribution, that the suffering, if it is documented carefully enough, is also data, and that the data will be used by people who have not yet been born to make decisions about bodies not yet formed. He does not stop, but he does not recover either. And the ground between those two facts is where he lives. And then there is the third colonist, and her story is the one that no one in mission control can prevent once it begins. An equipment failure, the kind that the pre-mission analysis assigned a probability low enough to proceed, because every system that can fail has been assigned such a probability, and the mission would never launch if it waited for every probability to reach zero. The failure cascades in a direction that the redundancies were not designed for, as because the redundancies were designed by engineers working from the best available models, and the best available models were built from data collected in conditions that are not quite like this, in a place that is not quite like this, under variables that resist perfect prediction. The crew responds. They are trained for this, but the cascade moves faster than the training allows for, or it moves through a pathway the training did not anticipate, and by the time the situation has been fully understood, one person is beyond the reach of what the remaining crew can do. The signal that carries this information leaves Mars at the speed of light, traveling at 186,000 miles per second across the average distance of 225 million kilometers, and it arrives at Earth somewhere between 4 and 24 minutes after the moment it can no longer matter. Earth watches. Earth listens. Earth cannot move. The delay is not a failure of will, or attention, or care. It is physics. It is the distance. It is the fundamental and immovable fact that this argument has been returning to since the first word, that anyone who goes to Mars will never come back, not because they lack the desire, not because we lack the will to retrieve them, but because the physics of distance, the biology of adaptation, the mathematics of fuel that cannot be made fast enough or in sufficient quantity to guarantee return, and the psychology of permanent exile conspire together to make the word home mean something different once you have crossed that threshold. They will land on red soil, and they will look up at a pale blue dot in the Martian sky and know they are farther from home than any human has ever been, carrying inside their bodies every fact that this investigation has assembled: the bone loss proceeding in the low gravity, the radiation that no habitat wall fully stops, the cognitive decline that distance and isolation press quietly into the mind, the closed-loop life support systems that have never been proven to sustain a crew indefinitely without resupply. And they will know all of it because they read the same reports, and they said yes anyway. More than 200,000 of them said yes. From every country, every profession, every kind of ordinary human life. They looked at everything the evidence contains, and they placed it on one side of a scale, and they placed something else on the other side, and the scale tipped in the direction of going. The question of whether they are right is not ours to answer. It may not be anyone's to answer. It may only be answerable by the colonist in the greenhouse, or the one whose suffering becomes someone else's safety protocol, or the one whose signal arrives too late. And even then, they might not agree with each other. That is where the argument leaves us. And so here is where the argument finally has to give something back to you, after everything it has taken you through. The radiation accumulating in tissue that cannot heal it fast enough, the bones thinning in gravity that is not quite low enough to spare them, and not quite high enough to maintain them, the closed loop of air and water and food that depends on systems no one has ever proven can hold indefinitely, at the silence between a question sent and an answer received that stretches across minutes you cannot shorten by wanting them to be shorter. You have carried all of that, and now the argument has to be honest about what it cannot give you, a verdict. What it can offer instead is something older than verdicts. What the volunteers who said yes to Mars One were doing in 2012, when more than 200,000 of them responded to an announcement from a Dutch entrepreneur with no rockets and no established infrastructure, and, as it turned out, no path to solvency. What they were doing was not irrational. They were doing what human beings have done at every threshold where the known world ended and the unknown world began. They were picking up and going. Not because the going was safe, not because the return was guaranteed, but because the human animal has always had inside it a capacity for exactly this kind of reckoning, the one where you weigh everything that could go wrong against something harder to name, something closer to the question of what a life is for, and you decide that the weight on the second side is heavier. We have a word for this tradition, though we tend to apply it only in hindsight, when the crossing has already been made and the maps have already been redrawn, and the danger has been safely converted into history. We call it courage. We call it exploration. We call it the frontier spirit, as though it were a property of particular nationalities or eras rather than what it actually is, which is the oldest continuous thread running through the species, the willingness to leave the known for the unknown, and to trade the familiar for the possible, to stand at the edge of what can be seen and take one more step. Every time human beings have done this, they have gone somewhere that had no guarantee of return. The first people who left the African continent, approximately 70,000 years ago, did not know what the horizon held. They had no maps. They had no rescue signal. They had no trajectory back to the warmth of what they had left. They went anyway. The people who volunteer for Mars are not doing something new. They are doing the oldest thing. And still, the grief is real, because courage and grief are not opposites. They coexist in the same chest, in the same moment, in the same person, looking up at a pale blue dot in a rust-colored sky and understanding, perhaps for the first time in a way that is not theoretical, what it means to be that far from everything that made them. The science does not soften this. The mission architecture does not soften this. The knowledge that their suffering, if it comes, will become someone else's safety protocol does not soften this, though it may console it slightly, in the way that meaning consoles without erasing. So for them, for the colonist who tends the greenhouse and watches the green persist against everything this world has done to resist it, for the one whose body tells the story of what permanent exile costs, for the one whose signal travels 225 million kilometers and arrives into hands that cannot help, for all of them, the argument offers what it can. May they find what they seek. May they build what they dream. May their sacrifice, if sacrifice it proves to be, and mean something to the species that sent them, and now it is yours. The question that has no clean answer, the scale that tips differently depending on what you place on the second side, the oldest human argument dressed in the language of orbital mechanics and bone density and propellant ratios. It comes down, as it always does, to something simpler and harder than all of that. Would you go? Would you stand at the threshold of everything this investigation has described, knowing it fully, and decide that the other side of it was worth reaching? And should we, as the species doing the sending, keep building toward that moment, keep designing the ships, keep recruiting the volunteers, keep accepting that some of what we love may not come home? Those are not rhetorical questions. If you found this investigation valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because your support is what makes these long and careful explorations possible. Tell me in the comments what you think about Mars colonization. Would you volunteer? Should humanity pursue this dream? And tell me what you think we should investigate next. The question of what it means to go somewhere you cannot return from has been with this species since the beginning. It will be with us still, long after the first footprint settles into the red soil of another world.